Hello everyone, thank you for listening. This is Irina. I'm a historian with a PhD in Nordic Studies. This is my small channel bringing some insight into Norse, Scandinavian, and German culture. Of course, a like and subscribe would mean a lot to me. Today we're going to talk about how hard life was in Viking Iceland for the settlers there, as well as how they themselves made life even harder by depleting the island completely of resources in a very short period of time. So Viking Iceland, as well as medieval Iceland, could be called a bad year economics, in the sense that if all went well, people could enjoy prosperity, but if something went wrong, then everything went really wrong. So Iceland was colonized initially by a small number of leaders who established a tight pattern of agricultural settlements based on animal husbandry, cattle and sheep, for instance, as well as hunting, gathering, so basically taking advantage of anything the island could provide, in order to shape a subsistence economy and a social landscape as well, on the model of Scandinavia mainly, which was meant to endure for hundreds of years. However, the long-term impact on the environment was quite serious, with an undynamic response to change and a long-scale impact which can be noticed nowadays as well. So, for example, the conversion of shrub forests into grassy pastures and hay fields meant an ecological experiment performed with little knowledge of local conditions, such as local climate, soils, or plants. Gradually, the population of Iceland became stagnant, dangerously vulnerable to volcanism, epidemics, and starvation. There is evidence that human environmental impact predated non-human climate change, such as cooling. There is one passage in the old Icelandic sagas describing the richness of Iceland. At the beginning, it is a chapter from the saga of Egil, chapter 29, where we get insight into what chieftain Skallagrim did, how he settled his own household, and we have details such as the fact that grazing was happening all year round, that forests stretch from the mountain to the sea, that there was a lot of driftwood, as well as stranded whales. That people took advantage of wild foods as well, and that complex households came about under a particular chieftain controlling the cultural landscape. How great these chieftains were from the very beginning might also be a reflection of the development in the later Viking times, so in the medieval times, 13th century, so we are close to the end of the Free State in Iceland. But anyway, we can conclude that the rapid colonization suggested by radiocarbon data, as well as tephra, so ash, volcanic ash layers observed right below the earliest archaeological deposit in places such as Bessastaðir, Seltjarnas, and Hofstaðir, even marginal areas exploited and quickly abandoned by the 12th century. So yeah, people came here quite hopeful, and they colonized the island, and they really did not think in perspective about what was going to happen if they start consuming everything at once. There is an emphasis on sheep and goats. Cattle were also extremely important, but the proportion is about 1 to 4. Apparently, pigs were also important at the beginning, at least, but the population steadily declined, as they are well suited to feeding on the roots of birch and willow. They are considered to have been a major element of environmental change. Well, all wild resources present in the record, so for example bird bones and eggshells, prove the fact that people used everything they could catch, but it is also important to notice that each settlement unit was based mainly on the production of domesticated animals. The natural limitations of Iceland's productivity did much to shape its development. By the 13th century, the pressure was clear. Fisheries, for example, rose as an alternative, and we have much more tenant farmers, so poorer farmers who came to work on richer farmers' households or farms. Erosion and overgrazing diminished the production of the grasslands overall, and this meant that the value of the lowland properties increased. The main problem resides not in the biomass itself, probably enough, at least in the early years of settlement, but in the way it was employed. So I mean by that the animals were sent to the highlands early in the short summer. Grasslands were grazed when the grass was most vulnerable. As the upland soils were shallow, the effects were severe as the herds quickly diminished all the grassland. So erosion and a finite number of lowland meadows, these conditions were decisive for the future evolution of the island. There were conditions very different from continental Europe, where we have large amounts of forests as well as marshland, which could have been used as pastures or as agricultural land. The forests in Iceland in the lower highlands were dense with brush and dwarf forest, whereas the lowlands were full of birch tree. The livestock quickly affected all this subarctic ecology. Erosion was irregular, but we can safely say that by 1300 the upper highlands completely denuded. The soil level significantly was raised in the lower highlands, and the birch forest was also gone pretty quickly, and the raised soil in the lowlands started to erode toward the bedrock as well. To all of this, we can also add the climate factor. So between the 9th and 12th century, we are dealing with a milder climate, which actually favored settlement. We have an average of over 4 degrees. But afterwards, people here experience a cooling trend. This means a lot of drift ice as well. But we do have intermittent periods of warmth as well. The cooling, however, affected the subsistence economy, as it is very difficult to tell how much fodder you would have available the upcoming winter. In other words, how much livestock you would be able to keep alive, and this increased the sense of competition between farmers as well, which was a decisive factor in the political turmoil happening at the end of the 30th century, which ultimately led to the dominance of Norway on the island. After the 10th century, famine and sickness becomes quite common, as the variability of climate was essential in this development. Cold, rainy summers, for example, meant you were not able to keep livestock alive. Nevertheless, you could have little chance in resorting to communal units known as hreppar. These were units which controlled grazing lands and organized common labor, some kind of local insurance, but they also had limited resources. Sometimes there was no other chance than to slaughter the animals, which meant that one winter you could actually be able to eat a lot of meat, but a second rainy summer was going to be hell for your household. So you had to do everything within your power to be able to keep your livestock supply. What could you do to prevent starvation? Well, worst case scenario, you could resort to stuff such as edible lichens, also seal hunting, getting seaweed as well, or searching for any kind of driftage, alongside raising more fisheries. Now, the population could rebound if there were enough young women surviving these hardships, but a lot of conflict emerged, with farmers stealing sheep from one another, for example. You read in the sagas a lot about such cases, or quarreling over cheese and hay and resources overall. Add to this unfortunate mix of factors, the volcanic eruptions as well, quite repeatedly in some parts of the island, and the difference between these eruptions was with several generations, but which meant that people didn't really have any possibilities, to expect them or to prepare for them. We read seldom about this in sagas or chronicles, but we do have a documented eruption, for example, in the annals of the bishopric of Skolholt in 1362, followed by, as you could imagine, hunger and starvation. So this was my small presentation on the hardships of people in Iceland and how they also contributed to them. If you are aware of any current projects of trying to regrow the forests, for example, in Iceland, I would be very curious to know about them, as well as about the possibility of, improving what had been destroyed over the course of a lot of centuries, one might say. Thank you once again for listening, and if you like this kind of information, please subscribe and like my videos.